Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and here at Bruegel, we are undergoing a research project on the future of work and inclusive growth in Europe. The project analyzes the impact of technology on the nature, quantity, and quality of work, welfare systems, and inclusive growth at large. The Sound of Economics is proud to contribute to the project with a space for discussion and analysis on this theme. And I'm happy to be accompanied today by Laura Nursky, who coordinates this project at Bruegel. Hi Laura, how are you?
Hi Giuseppe, I'm very well, thank you, and I'm glad to be in our studio live for the first time.
Indeed, today we are both in the studio, and that's a much better way of recording a podcast than online. Though, when speaking about the jobs of the future, one of the most striking references I like to make is a set of predictions that Arthur C. Clarke, the author of 2001 Space Odyssey, made back in 1964. I would like to start this episode by reading a passage from his famous speech on how the 2000s would look like. He said, "It will be possible in that age, perhaps only 50 years from now, for a man to conduct his business from Tahiti or Bali just as well as he could from London. Almost any executive skills, any administrative skills, even any physical skills could be made independent of distance. I'm perfectly serious when I suggest that one day we may have a brain surgeons in Edinburgh operating on patients in New Zealand." As you may have guessed, today's topic is about online labor. And joining me and Laura for this is Fabian Stefani, a researcher in social data science at the Oxford Internet Institute and a research affiliate at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin, as well as a member of the Excellence Network of the Bruegel Project on the Future of Work. Welcome to the Sound of Economics, Fabian.
Thank you. Thanks, Giuseppe. Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me.
Unfortunately, Fabian is remotely connected and not with us in the studio, but we are doing a little bit of Arthur C. Clarke thing over there. Fabian, you are the co-creator of the Online Labor Observatory, a digital data hub hosted by the International Labour Organization and OII for researchers, policymakers, journalists, and the public interest in online platform work. So you heard the words of Arthur C. Clarke from 1964, and I imagine they resonate with you. But online labor is something a bit more specific than the generic remote working, which is what Clarke got right back then in his prediction. Could you explain to our listeners a little bit more precisely what is online labor or remote platform work? What's the difference with teleworking, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of distinctions that need to be made. Clarke was surprisingly accurate in his prediction with regard to some aspects. So the internet allows us to do a lot of things remote. And in the world of work, I think you can broadly make two distinctions. So work that's been mediated by the internet, but is not happening on the internet. So you think of gig workers in food delivery or ride hailing, for example. And here, of course, we use digital technologies. We use the internet to mediate this work, to call a driver, for example, via our app. But then the actual service happens in the same place, brings buyer and seller, brings the customer and the deliverer of this service together in one place. And then on the other hand, you have online mediated work that is also happening online. And this is the work that we are particularly interested in our research group here. And that is also the type of work that we are trying to monitor globally with the online labor index, which is a central part of the online labor observatory. I know it might be, you get easily confused with all the names and acronyms because it's also hosted at the OII, which is the Oxford Internet Institute, and the ILO. But this online mediated work that is also happening online is the thing that we're interested in. So these could be jobs like graphic designers, for example, could also be software developers. So essentially, everything that can be done via the internet can be done on a computer and then delivered digitally.
Thanks, Fabian. Giuseppe, I think one other aspect that distinguishes online platform work from regular telework is that telework is usually referred to in the context of a traditional employment relationship. So a regular employee doing his regular work that he always does, but not at his desk in the office, but from his desk at home or some other place. So what distinguishes online platform work from this regular telework is that online platform work really redefines the boundaries of the firm. Which tasks do we do inside the organization with regular employees, and which tasks do we outsource to usually self-employed people, freelancers, etc. So this really takes place in this discussion of the core versus the crowd. You know, this new technologies allow the work to be organized in a different way and pushing tasks from the core, organized with employees, to the crowd, which are outside of the boundaries of the firm and are self-employed. And one consequence of that is that this gives less security to these people who are not on traditional employment contracts. So that might lead to more precariousness, although it also gives more flexibility to the workers. So I think that's also one major difference.
Clearly, I was already too deep in the material here, because I was already talking only exclusively about platform mediated work or gig work as it's often referred to. But of course, in the broader universe of work in general that can be mediated via the internet, of course, there is the let's say conventional type of work where people are, let's say, employed, as Laura said, with a company, but now, particularly increasingly due to the pandemic and the economic repercussions of COVID-19, this work is legally the framework, the institutional framework has remained the same, but the geographical location might differ now. So people might have the flexibility or maybe even the need to do this work remote from home, for example, or some other place. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what sort of tasks and occupations are happening in this online mediated online work? Is it high-skilled tasks, low-skilled tasks?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's a very broad spectrum actually of tasks, both in terms of skill level and also in terms of economic conditions. So the payment that people receive. So first of all, the interesting thing is Arthur Clarke was right with regard to the aspect that it did become a global market. So we do see these global spans, these global connections. So we do see graphic designer, logo designer from New Zealand, for example, designing a logo for somebody who has a company, a newly founded company, and looks for a logo in New York or in San Francisco. In terms of work, there are different ways to categorize this work. And for our research, for most of the time, we've been using 6 categories to categorize this work. And they really span from, let's say, in the skill spectrum, they span from relatively simple work, so data entry work and data clerical work. So, for example, transcribing something that has been written on paper to an Excel spreadsheet would be a task that you could do. And then you have more topical work with specific domain knowledge. So translation work, for example, is a big part of the work that's going on these online labor platforms. People translating from Korean to English, from French to Spanish. And then you obviously have a lot of tasks, let's say, in the admin and professional service sector. So you have people that do accounting, people are doing finance, people are doing consulting. And last but not least, you have a very big, and it has always been relatively big, but growing tech sector. So where you have really very tech savvy tasks. So people are producing data visualizations, people are programming bits and pieces of software, and they are maintaining server infrastructures, for example. So as you see, it's a very within the framework of people of work that could be done remote via the internet. It's a very, very broad frame.
I want to go back to the issue of the kind of tasks and skills later on, because that's really core to the conversation we are having here. But coming to the second aspect that you mentioned, and also referring to the Clark's quote again, the geographical spread, the geographical implication of the distribution of the demand and supply of online labor across the globe. You mentioned that this is a global market, but obviously here we are also focusing our conversation on what's the situation in Europe. We want to learn a little bit more about the geographical implications of this for Europe and what kind of differences, regional differences you might have recorded on this. Especially, is there anything that relates to national borders which is still relevant to this conversation or not?
Oh yeah, so this leads us into a field of many interesting observations. I'll try to pick some of them, and I'll try to stay in the European context, maybe, even though I really have to underline, if you really want to understand the dynamics of this market, you have to have a look at the global scale.
Yeah, maybe the interplay between the European setup and the geography and the global, how do we position several places in Europe within this global market and vice versa, and what kind of observation we can make at our continental scale.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about this market is it's what economists, or the more specifically economists working in this field of economic geography, call it's a so-called scale-free market. What does this mean? This means that patterns, regardless of the scale of the market. So it's the same kind of distribution pattern, whether you look at a global level, at a regional level, or within one country. So there are interesting observations to be made also for Europe. You mentioned traditional boundaries, national boundaries. They are not that important anymore. And there's also interesting work going on checking whether there is still something going on across these national boundaries. I would say it's much more defined by language. So you do see, for example, that there are specific market ties within language groups. So again, on the global level, you see this, for example, a strong connection between the UK and India, for example, also the United States and India. And this is clearly, besides many other reasons, due to a common language that they speak with. To talk about Europe, you see this advantage of languages, for example, or this defining feature, how the pathways of this work are shaped by language, with the example of the UK, because the UK is by far the most active buyer of online mediated work, at least in the data that we are analyzing in Europe. And that is definitely because of path dependencies that come from the English language. So that people on these markets are just naturally, because for many of the people in the UK, English is their mother tongue, the majority, they're able to communicate of online mediated work around the world. But you see also other interesting patterns. You see, speaking of path dependencies, you do see that the reoccurring theme that even though these markets are relatively new markets, like say 10, maybe 15 years old, depending on where you set the starting point for online mediated work, they're not reinventing the wheel in the sense that they are still very much related to the on-site economy and what is happening in the conventional labor market, in the conventional economy, if you want to put it like this. So especially talking about specializations, for example. So within Europe, you see that in terms of sellers of work, people delivering online mediated work, you see that in many countries of the former Eastern Bloc, particularly, for example, Ukraine, you see a lot of people engaged in tech work, over proportionally engaged in technology-related work. And interestingly, also a relatively large share of female freelancers compared to other countries engaged in this type of work. And I think one of the reasons for this might be a path dependency, because we know that coming from history, there was always a relatively strong human capital build-up in tech work, in technology-related services in these countries, in terms that a lot of people, or a large share of people, studied IT-related subjects. And this has always been, also before the emergence of the internet, been relatively gender balanced. And it's interesting to see how these historical path dependencies coming from the past are shaping the way that online mediated work has been done today.
Fabian, you explained to us how the languages that are spoken create some sub-markets, right, within which they compete with other workers who speak the same language. But within the same language groups, there's still different levels of local wages. So what does that mean for these people? For example, high-wage English-speaking countries to compete with low-wage English-speaking countries.
So this is crucial. This is a tricky point. I mean, we had a research where we looked at first of all on a very macro level perspective, looked at online labor markets, and I think regarding the data that we've gathered with a very unique perspective. So for the first time, with a very, very large data set covering all countries that are active in this market, at least that we can cover with our data. So millions of projects and workers and many countries. And what we realized is that this work is strongly polarized. And we tried to find out why is it so strongly polarized, because thinking about the, many of the hypotheses that had initially been made about the internet, that the internet would turn the earth into something flat, like the flat earth. I think Friedman wrote a book about this. With the name of Flat Earth. We've been wondering, why is this the case? Why is it the internet as a technology assumed flatten geographies and tear down boundaries, and we still see work being so strongly polarized? And one of the factors that we found was language, but there were obviously, as you just alluded now, other factors as well, and these are economic factors. So wage levels definitely play a role quite naturally. Thinking with an economist's mind, like work tends to flow where price levels are relatively low, but the most strong determinant of the polarization of online mediated work, both globally, also in Europe, and even within countries, is the prevalence of skills, of marketable skills, of relevant skills. So I would say, coming back to your questions, that having marketable skills is more important than the price tag that you pin to it. What I'm trying to say here is that there are some skills on this market that are extremely valuable, and they are so valuable that the price level, the local price level, becomes much less relevant than whether people actually have this skill or not. So we see this, for example, within countries as well. We see this in Europe, in all countries actually, with a strong focus towards the major cities. So the majority of the work is extremely distributed. The majority of the work is been done in the major cities, and even when you consider, population density and take this into consideration, and that is because these cities are the hubs where the knowledge is, where the human capital is, and where the marketable skills are.
Great. Thanks, Fabian. You illustrated to us the importance of having the right skills on these platforms. And I want to move the conversation now to the policy agenda, because what is really high on the European policy agenda now is how we can improve the skills anticipation system. So how can we know which skills will be in demand, like in the near future or in the far future, and how we can use this knowledge to better align our educational systems with the needs of our labor market. Now, a lot of these discussions on skills, they stay at a fairly high level. So we need more digital skills, and then sometimes they make the distinctions. Do we need like very basic digital literacy skills, or do we really need like the advanced AI skills? But further than that, there's a big need to have a higher level of concreteness in the types of skills we need. And I know you've been working on this, and I know there's also different ways of approaching this. There's quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. So in the qualitative approach, you do interviews with local companies and you ask them what are the skills that you need and that you cannot find at the moment. On the quantitative side, you can use big data sets to infer what are these emerging skills. And I know of two ways, using data from online vacancies and using data from online labor markets. And I wanted to ask you if you can comment a little bit on this, on how we can use these big data sets on learning more about emerging skills.
Yeah, that's a truly relevant question. I mean, maybe if I may, just a quick word on the qualitative and quantitative part. I mean, this is also what I try to tell my students. Those are both two sides of the same coin. Ideally, you have what we would call, then technically speaking, mixed methods. Ideally, you would cover both sides, because the macro level, the big data, gives you a good perspective on how relevant a certain problem is. But if you want to really understand the functionalities, I think you really have to talk to people. You have to talk to entrepreneurs, to job seekers, to businesses. But now, naturally, talking about a bit more about the big data part. Yeah, so this is really the skill gap. So in increasing skill gap, and that's been growing over the last years, it has become apparent not only on online labor markets, but in the conventional economy as well. There are some jobs, high skilled jobs, that remain vacant for a very long time because businesses are not able to find adequately skilled workers for that. And at the same time, we see at another end of the labor market, we see how people might lose their jobs, or at least wages deteriorate, because some of the skills, and that's important to notice, it's not the entire occupation, but it's some of the skills within this occupation become less relevant. They get also under price pressure because of automation, because of digitalization, because some skills can be automated. And there are several ways to do this. The tricky thing here, I think, is that this change is happening relatively fast, and you need to have a systematic oversight on what is happening here. And there's been a lot of research where people try to do this, and often with, let's say, conventional data. So they looked, as you said, they asked people, and they looked at census data and labor market statistics. But I think that some of these statistics might be a bit too slow. The lag might be too large to capture some of the new developments. That's one thing. And also, this data might not be granular enough to have a look at what is actually going on under the hood, what is going on within an occupation. How do little specific skill aspects within an occupation change? So is one specific programming language becoming more important in let's say, in the job of a financial analyst than another one? And there are very interesting new ways to do this with big data and online data. One of them you mentioned is looking at online job vacancies, which is interesting because they tend to cover the entire economy. So they really, or at least a very large part of the economy. I don't know if all occupations been advertised on online job platforms like Indeed, for example, but a large share of jobs or of occupations, of industries are covered with this data. And there you can very closely, with techniques like natural language processing, for example, and data mining, you can closely monitor what the skills are that are required for these positions and how they are geographically distributed, for example, because this also changes in this process of digitalization. More work is moving to the city, maybe away from the countryside. But one disadvantage from my perspective is, even though this data covers a large share of the labor market, is that it's the demand side. So it's what companies are looking for. And that might actually come back to the initial problem, because they might be looking for specific skill sets and jobs and skill bundles, if you want to call it like that, do not exist, or that they're very, very, very scarce. So with that regard, it might be more helpful or useful to actually look at the data that we are governing here, which is online labor market data. Because while the disadvantage with online labor market data is that we're not covering the entire economy, of course, we're only, in that sense, looking at jobs that are digitally mediated. So we're not looking at manual physical work. A lot, actually, of this is not been covered on online labor markets. But the advantage here is we're able to look at both the demand and the supply side, and even how they meet, what kind of projects they agree on, what kind of prices they agree on. And this gives us a very interesting perspective on the evaluation of individual skills. But I think more interestingly, when we come to creating sustainable jobs and sustainable reskilling, more interestingly, at the joint evaluation of skills. So how the combination of specific skills are being evaluated on these markets. Because the thing is, this is relevant because we are not starting reskilling out of the blue. We all have skills already. We know the days of front loading and education are over. So it's not that we learn something in school and university in the first 20 years of our lives, and then we apply this for the next 40 or 50 years. So we always have to relearn and learn new things, but we're attaching these skills to the capabilities that we already have. And that is why it's really important, I think, from my perspective, to look at the value, the complementary value, if you want to call it like that, of a skill, in addition to the skills that you already have.
Fabian, you mentioned this aspect of data, because the online world is by its nature very data heavy. There is one aspect that you already pointed out, is about what we can learn about the skills from this labor data that is available. Can you tell us a little bit more broadly what we can learn more from this vast array of online labor data, especially about the offline world, if it's possible to make a bridge between the online labor data and the offline, and also how can policymakers use this data to better align policy with the needs of workers and businesses?
So absolutely, as I said earlier, the online labor market or the online labor economy has its own dynamics because it's happening in a new ecosystem. It's happening digitally, it's happening on platform, but it's not detached from the conventional economy. It's real people, it's actual real businesses demanding this service, and it's actual real human beings and workers supplying these services. So whenever we see such a transaction, and sometimes even as an internet researcher, you tend to forget about this when you just look at your screen and these digitally transferred services and all these numbers. It is always two entities, really existing entities, that exchanging something here. So it is a business that really is demanding this service and is willing to attach a certain price to a certain service and to a certain set of skills. And on the other hand, there's a real human being that has at some point learned these skills and is able to apply these skills and receives an income from applying these skills. So it does allow us to say something about the conventional labor market, of course, only with regard to a smaller subset of the labor market. So more about graphic designers and less about firefighters, and more about software developers and less about gardeners, for example. But these are also very, very relevant jobs and increasingly relevant jobs, particularly the ones that are working together with digital technologies. And I think there's also another advantage of looking at these online labor markets, because I think they are more agile, they're moving faster, and they have a slight lead in terms of economic developments compared to the conventional labor market. I mean, I might be contested here, and this is still something that we're trying to investigate. But I could imagine that as these markets are, to a certain extent, have less friction, just because they are digital, and then products and services can move very quickly. And also because workers are more agile in terms of learning new skills on these labor markets. So there's interesting research showing that these workers are developing new ways of acquiring skills via relatively unconventional modes of learning. So social media-based learning, for example, online tutorial-based learning. And these are reasons why I think that the developments on the online labor market lead the developments on the conventional labor market. And that also makes it interesting. And now coming to the second part of your question, makes it interesting for policymakers, for those people that try to help shaping this process of sustainable reskilling and preparing the workforce, both online and on-site, preparing the workforce for a more, let's say, automation struck or more digitalized future. And I think you might have guessed this already. I mean, one of the recommendations for policy actors would be to have a close look at this data, to find ways to leverage not only the online labor market data, but maybe also the other data sources that we spoke about, data from online job vacancies, or maybe looking at platforms like LinkedIn, for example, where you naturally, if you know this platform, can see that there's also a big scope for looking at the combination of different skills and in which industries and geographically, how are they applied. And to, first of all, be aware that there is like a pond, a gigantic ocean of data that could be tapped into to address some of these questions, about regional demand for skills, about regional supply of skills, about the value of specific skills in a specific industry context, in a specific geographical context, for example. And then, of course, it brings us to the somewhat more tricky question: how, after the awareness, comes the action? How to work with this data, how to get engaged also with these platforms, and brings us also to the question of maybe the responsibility of these platforms, as they are, by the process of their work, kind of harvesting this data, harvesting this information, but what do we do with it? And I think, without going into a lot of political details on the responsibility of these platforms, I think what should definitely not be the case is that this data is harvested we as researchers say it's valuable, but then nothing is done with this data. I think this is something we cannot accept in a world where we increasingly see pressure on the labor market, on companies and on workers, on firms and on workers, due to automation and digitalization.
Very true, Fabian. As you rightly mentioned, behind all of this big data are real people, real businesses. So the Commission is looking closely at the working conditions of these people and their well-being. So in December, the Commission released a proposal to improve the working conditions of people working through these digital labor platforms. It focused a lot on the correct classification of the employment status and also algorithmic management of how these tasks are allocated to people on these platforms and the necessary transparency that goes with it. So I wanted to ask your opinion on this proposal, and then especially related to the difference between online platform work and on-site platform work. Do you think this distinction is necessary in the context of this proposal, and does the proposal address the main challenges that online platform workers are faced with?
Having a close look at this phenomena. This is, I think, compared to other economic regions of the world, really a unique progress. But coming more specifically to your question, is the distinction between online work and online on-site work, so online mediated but happening on-site, necessary? I think I would say yes and no, because particularly coming to the aspect that you mentioned first about the formalization of the employment status. What's the status of these people? Are they employed? Are they self-employed? Do we need to figure out a dimension somewhere in between? Are they temporarily employed? This is something I think that everybody in the, very broadly speaking, gig economy can relate to, whether this person is a graphic designer on a platform like Fiverr, or whether this person is an Uber driver, to be very, very precise. So this is something that definitely needs to be settled, because I think the same rules as in the on-site, the conventional economy apply. If somebody is continuously working for the same employer again and again and again, and is not classified as an employee, then in the conventional economy, we would speak of a pseudo freelancing, kind of a pseudo self-employed status, which is, for various aspects, I think, not acceptable. And I think the same rules with regard to this should apply in the online economy. But on the other hand, there is also a difference. And I mean, there's a clear difference if you think about the nature of work. So I think it's fair to say that many gig workers, both on-site and online, enjoy flexibility. I think for many of them, a reason why they have chosen the job, or one of the aspects why they have chosen this to do this work, is flexibility. Though the degree of flexibility is, as you can imagine, different. For an on-site worker, there might be much less flexibility. So though there is naturally less flexibility, if you have to ride a car or ride a bike from one location to the next, while comparing this to somebody who's working online and might be much more flexibly able to allocate work, both in terms of timing and also in terms of geographic location, taking your laptop with you and doing this from home, or doing this from a friend's place or in a cafe. But I would say the crucial aspect here is, again, coming back to skills, because these online mediated markets really amplify the leverage that you have if you have marketable skills. And I would say the more marketable your skill is, you already see this in remuneration, in income. But I think you can also link this to flexibility. The more flexibility you have, the more negotiation power you have, essentially. And so I would say one need to have a close look at this skill dimension, because for some of these workers, so what I'm trying to say is there should be some kind of basic regulation that assures that all the things that we try to prevent in the conventional economy from happening, that where we try to protect workers, for example, we should find a way to transfer this here. But we should also acknowledge that for some of these workers, working conditions are not terrible at all. So particularly on the high skill end, there is, both in terms of income and in terms of flexibility, these are, under certain circumstances, extremely profitable jobs. And it makes it difficult for policymakers to navigate, I know, but you have to take this into consideration, that this is an extremely polarized market. Also with regard to, let's say, with regard to the working conditions, it's also an extremely polarized market. Yeah.
Fabian, we could really discuss about this for a couple of more hours, if not more. But unfortunately, we have to wrap up the episode because that's all the time we have allocated for today. But definitely, we are keeping this conversation open at Bruegel within the frame of the project, which you are part of, obviously, but also in general in our programs of events and future podcasts. So definitely you are probably coming back to the Sound of Economics at some point together with me and Laura, and we could comment on and go a little bit more deep into some of the issues and fascinating questions that we've been trying to address today. Thank you so much for joining us from Oxford, and Laura, thanks so much. This brings us to the end of this episode. I just want to remind our listeners that this installment was linked to the research project at Bruegel on future work and inclusive growth in Europe. And the Sounds of Economics will keep following the project, and there will be more episodes dedicated to the theme to come. And as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot for joining the Sound of Economics. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.